Congressman Tom Davis is stuck in traffic and will be here shortly, but I'm going to introduce him and Earl Pomeroy at the same time. First of all, welcome to KEI. Tuesday's election was very interesting, astounding to many unexpected, quite unexpected results to several people, mostly to the pollsters who still are trying to figure out what their role in the world is. To the Republicans, it was a time of elation because of capturing the Senate and keeping the House. But with majorities in both houses, Republicans realize their obligation is to govern Congress. The House will have difficulty in blaming the Senate, and vice versa when the same party controls both chambers. But we have to remember it still takes 60 votes to move most legislation in the Senate. To discuss the impact of the election, we have two panels of participants. The first panel is composed of former members of Congress, including me. The second panel, which will be led by Troy Stangerone, our Director of Congressional Affairs, and he'll introduce the participants, all of whom are former congressional staff members, 3 from the Senate and 1 from the House. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Congressman Tom Davis and Earl Pomeroy. Tom represented Virginia's 11th Congressional District from 1995 to 2008. He's now the Director of Governmental Affairs at Deloitte. His congressional district is the suburbs of Washington, D.C. He chaired the House Government Reform Committee from 2003 until 2007. That committee is the chief investigative arm of the House. He was also chairman of the NRCC, the National Republican Congressional Committee, from 1998 until 2002. The NRCC's task is to raise money, recruit candidates, and help strategically and financially in their campaigns to keep seats Republican or to oust the Democrats. The Democratic equivalent of the NRCC is the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the DCCC, and one of its past chairmen was former Congressman Martin Frost of Texas. This year, Tom Davis and Martin Frost released their book, The Partisan Divide, Congress in Crisis. So that should be quite interesting. I haven't read it yet. Congressman Davis was born in Minot, North Dakota, which is a good segue to introducing Congressman Earl Pomeroy, Democrat of North Dakota. Earl, did you know that Tom was born in North Dakota?
I did indeed, yeah.
Okay, well, I planned it that way, you know. Earl represented the entire state at large from 1993, the year I was sworn in. We were classmates in the 103rd Congress, and he left Congress in January of 2011. He is now senior counsel at Alston and Bird, specializing in healthcare issues. When Earl was in Congress, he served on the Agriculture Committee and also on the Ways and Means Committee, where he served on the Subcommittee on Trade. And while Tom was raising money to defeat Earl, Earl defied incredible odds by being a Democrat in a really, really red state. In 1992, Earl had no desire to run for Congress, having served 2 terms as North Dakota Insurance Commissioner and intended to serve in the Peace Corps in the former Soviet Union. First term, North Dakota Senator Kent Conrad was up for re-election in 1992, but when he was elected in 1986, he had told his constituents he would not run for re-election unless the federal deficit had fallen. It didn't fall. He kept his word and decided not to run, leaving an open seat in the House. And instead of going into the Peace Corps in the old Soviet Union, Earl surprised everybody, including himself, and ran for the House seat. And by the way, Earl was also born in North Dakota. I thought that people should know that.
Right? Yeah, very good.
These are 2 extraordinary men who served with dignity and respect. I had the honor of serving several years with both of them. Both could be considered moderates if you look at the National Journal's rating of members of Congress. Earl is the quintessential Plains prairie populist who brought to Congress his heart and plans for public service in the Peace Corps. Tom, how are you?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Good to see you. That's okay.
Just getting introductions wrapped.
We just told some stories about you, and some were true. And Earl is he's the Plains Prairie populist, and brought to Congress the heart that he has for people that he wanted to share with the people in the Soviet Union as a member of the Peace Corps. Tom brought another type of dynamic to the Congress, a person with an extraordinary grasp of the details and needs of every congressional district in the country. He labored to recruit candidates who would mirror the hearts of the people he or she would represent. If there was any motto Tom could have contrived, it would have been, members of Congress need to realize they are not in Congress to represent themselves, but the people who elected them. So, the election ended on Tuesday, and still hasn't finished. And Earl, let me first go to you and give us your general impressions of the election, what you read from it, what you don't read from it, and then I'll ask the same question of Tom.
Thank you. Well, a couple of introductory words to start. This whole business of Peace Corps to Congress changed in a weekend the nominating convention when they had to find somebody to endorse for the congressional race. Well, I was pretty well along on my plans for the Peace Corps, and in this wild 24 hours trying to figure this out, someone took me aside. He said, "Earl, put the Peace Corps on hold. You don't have to go to Moscow to find a government in chaos." And that was a kind of a guiding principle. Follow. I would also I want to express my congratulations to you, Don, for your important responsibilities post-Congress. This is an institute I care a good deal about. Members of Congress, have this fabulous opportunity to learn a lot about different things, and inevitably you'll see some of them in the course of their careers attached to issues, attached to countries. Well, I attached to Korea because in 1994 I became the father of a Korean-born little girl, and in 1996 a little boy, also born in both born in Busan by coincidence. They're now in college, the joy of my life, and so I made it a point in the years to come to learn as much as I could about Korea. Traveled there on several occasions, and just have enormous feel for the beautiful heart of the people of Korea, who, in leading the way relative to international adoption, put the interests of children above all, and that has allowed me to have this great experience. So it still is something very near to my heart, as you can see, and I therefore care a lot about the work of this institute. Well, election night, we took a shellacking as a Democrat. It was a wave election. We've had so many wave elections. You'd think that we're about out of waves, but without question, and I'll defer to our real expert on the panel, Tom Davis, but without question, this was a wave election by any definition, and you might even say it's the fifth in a row. 06, 08, 2010, the one that got me. 12, little less so, except with the strong re-election of the president, and pretty good performance down ballot. I think you could call 12 a mini wave. This was a big wave, and there's some people who look mighty, mighty smart, none more so than Mitch McConnell, who's quoted in the paper the other day. I love this quote. Sometimes all the fancy political strategies and the highfalutin dimensions of politics in the 21st century can be boiled down pretty simply. He says, well, you get your best players on the field in November. Avoid doing something that makes us look like we're not adult enough to govern, and hope the wave is big. And I think that those elements, which I know you've been reading like I have been reading, were very exactingly executed in the course of this campaign. A lot of coverage about the Tea Party wing versus the establishment, and the establishment strikes back kind of dimension to this. I didn't know if it was just kind of the fluff and nonsense of the 24-hour news cycle, but when you think about it, all these primaries, endorsements, the challenges to elderly, kind of feeble incumbents, well, as it all ended up, the least dangerous candidate won in each instance relative to Republican hopes. We didn't have anybody out there shooting his mouth off with something stupid we could use against candidates all over the country, not just endangering that one seat, but all the seats. And the coverage over the last 2 days has shown this is no accident. They were very exacting about looking at who was running and making early plays to get the stronger candidate to the fore. All right. Are we adult enough to govern? Well, you sure didn't see any shutdowns for a while, have you? And for the disproportionate amount of coverage, Senator Cruz, with his much more combative style than I would say Mitch McConnell, with an exceedingly clever but more conventional approach at political positioning. It has been the conventional approach for months. I mean, Rand Paul doesn't even look like the guy that came in a while ago. Again, conforming more, less so with Cruz, but with Paul, conforming more to the conventional dimensions of how this game is played. All right, so they put the best players on the field. They looked adult enough to govern. And what about this wave? Some very interesting statistics underlying this wave. I'll just kind of quickly run through them. 34% of voters said they were showing opposition to President Obama, 20% showing support, 14% margin. That's as bad as it was in 2006 against George Bush, who was at that time prosecuting 2 unpopular wars. So the unpopularity of this president was clearly a driving issue in this campaign, was very, very significant. Beneath that, a deep cynicism about government and politics with the American public, more than I have seen. 1 in 5 say they trust government to do the right thing. This is back to 1994 dimensions, when Newt Gingrich rode that to become Speaker of the House. So these are really key. These are benchmark indicators of a wave. 39% of Americans feel the country's on the right track. Now, I will say Democrats have some heartburn on this. My gosh, economy continues to recover, unemployment 200,000 plus, month after month after month, stock market record highs, gas prices low. But people in large dimension are not feeling it. They're pessimistic about it, country on the wrong track, and the White House has not been successful at putting a different vision out there. Now, White House versus Congress. Well, Congress is much more unpopular than the White House. With
12% approval.
12% approval, 80% disapproval. You know, but they feel like it's better. It got down as low as 9. So they got a few. It was down to friends and family. Now they got some cousins back. So but by and large, the overriding issue was the economy, and 4 in 10 put it that way. And here we're getting, again, our economy would be the envy of most of Europe, just for an example. Not Germany, but most of the rest of it. But there's some figures that show a very different thing happening relative to what American expectation is relative to the future. And I like to think of Americans as very optimistic people. 44, let me see.
Let's ask Tom the same question.
Just to wrap up.
Okay.
And I'm unable to dig out the particular figure, but most feel that the future will be worse for their children than it has been for them. That is a figure that has held true for several election cycles, and I think drives the wave elections. The wave election is less about the rally about the challenger. It's about the disappointment with the crowd that's been in and their inability to reverse this pessimism and to create once again a much more hopeful vision of the future. I don't know what it's going to take, and I don't care who's in charge, it does it. But I really want America to get this notion again that our best days are in front of us, and our children are going to have better lives better careers than we've been able to have.
Okay,
Don?
Tom, your general impressions of the election.
감사합니다. 안녕하세요. Let me also pay tribute to this institution. So
Thank you.
I've worked with many of you on the visa waiver for South Korea, Korea Free Trade Agreement, and I think congratulations.
Thank you.
This is great. A couple things. Earl is right in terms of this was not an election where people were voting for Republicans. This isn't about who the Republicans were, it's about who they were not. And what they weren't is they weren't in charge. So people want to send a signal to the powers that be, and that's the president's party, and punish them in a midterm. This is normal in America. Over the last 150 years, the president's party has taken a beating in the midterms all but 3 times when you've had midterm elections. So this is a kind of a normal event. On the Senate, the Republican gains were so high because you had Democrats 6 years ago when Obama was swept into office. 6 years ago was when their Senate term started. It was a Democratic wave. This time they're standing alone. Instead of a wind at their back, they had the wind coming out. And 7 of these Democrats were in states that Romney carried, and the Republicans beat every one of them. They also won a couple states that Romney barely lost as well in Colorado. So the Republicans basically took what was theirs and moved a little bit over. I always said voters in this country don't really like either party. What they do is they balance things when things they don't like it, and they'll send a message to whoever's in charge. My voters in Northern Virginia elected me to Congress in 1994 to protect them from Bill Clinton. 2 years later, they re-elected Clinton to protect them from me. So they're really not enthralled with either party, and Congress has been completely dysfunctional. We can get into the blame game, but it's just not working. And this was a protest vote, and Obama took the brunt of it as the leader. And it didn't help at the end to see the international situation a little bit uncertain, the Ebola virus not having control of things. I think all of this is people just don't feel the same confidence in him that they did when he was swept into office.
Tom, but you need to move that mic to your tie. No, you're not.
good. Just put it right
It's
up
just
here
not
on
on
your
me.
tie.
You can do that, or just clip it high to your tie. That'll do it.
For the TV, maybe.
The mic was hot. It just has to be
I'll
closer.
keep it right there. Is that any better? I don't hear any response from me. So this election, basically, the country is in these districts divided. That there weren't many seats in the House that were really up for grabs. 80% of the seats in the House of Representatives, we know which party is going to elect them year in and year out. They are pre-drawn to elect either a Republican or a Democrat. That is to the Republicans' advantage because the Republicans control the legislatures.
Is it broken? Tom,
We got a hot one here.
There we are.
There we go. Thank you. There. So, as I said,
higher on your
most
thigh.
of these most of the House districts are pre-drawn, so there wasn't that much room to move, but the Republicans still looks like they picked up about 15 seats. This will be the highest number of seats the Republicans have had in the House of Representatives since 1930. So this is a high water mark for them. The Republicans will control more state legislatures than they ever have in history before. So this was, as Earl says, a wave. I don't think anybody saw the votes of this magnitude happening. What really happened is the Democratic traditional voters, their soft voters, particularly minority voters, African-American voters, college students, didn't show up. Republican voters, particularly in rural areas, showed up in much greater numbers because they were angrier. This is what happens in midterms. The Republicans ended up being the beneficiaries of that. Now, just a couple sidelines. In New York City, we had a Republican congressman who was under indictment by the Federal Justice Department, and he was reelected. But this was not an anomaly in New York, because in New York you had 2 state senators and assemblymen also under indictment who won re-election. So if you have a criminal record, you can go to New York. It doesn't make any. It doesn't seem to make any difference up there. Republican caucus added 2 African American members to their caucus in the House this time, getting a little bit more diverse. And of course, Larry Hogan, who was just elected the governor of Maryland in probably the biggest upset of election night, his wife is Korean.
That's why he was elected.
I think for Republicans in particular, making inroads into the ethnic vote, particularly the Asian vote, is a necessity if they want to be a majority party. They share basically the same value structure. A lot of entrepreneurs in the Asian community, people value education, but they've got to get past immigration and some of these issues to be able to tap into that. And Hogan certainly did it. Is just one example of that. And it wasn't just because he had a very good-looking Korean wife. It was also, he spent a lot of time in the community. I think he addressed a lot of the issues as well. The one thing that was remarkable is that Republican governors weren't punished. Republican governors who had had bad records, with the exception of Pennsylvania and maybe Alaska, that's still out, but in Alaska, the independent, who the other candidate was endorsed by Sarah Palin, so it was really kind of a split situation. Republican governors who were thought to be weak going into all one election. So this was basically an old-fashioned licking the Democrats took in this midterm, but it's not uncommon in America for the president's party to take a licking in midterm, and I don't think this means a thing going into 2016 in terms of what the terms of the electorate, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A.
I might just say 3 times the party in the midterm has avoided losing seats. During one of those times, Tom Davis was head of the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee. I know that because I was in his crosshairs for 2 years.
We didn't get him. But I'm glad we didn't get him. He's a good man.
But it was an extraordinary accomplishment in 2002, and Tom got the Republicans through that one without losing seats.
Let me ask you about this Virginia race that was on very few radar screens when apparently Senator Warner is going to be able to keep his seat, based on what I see now, and along comes Ed Gillespie, a longtime political operative, one ad after the other on his lobbying background, et cetera. Tom, what do you read into that?
I think races have become much more parliamentary. It used to be, when Earl and I started out in politics, we used to say voters voted for the name on the back of the jersey. Yep. Today, voters are voting for the color of the jersey. And that's what we saw in Virginia. We saw a nationalized race where Republicans were voting Republican, Democrats were voting Democrat. Mark Warner had traditionally enjoyed a lot of support in the Republican community and in the independent community. That evaporated on election night. They just bombarded him, saying he voted with Obama 97% of the time. The rural areas that Mark Warner had carried his last 2 elections, he got swamped in until he hit the wall in Northern Virginia. Also, black turnout was down. That's a key to Democratic victories in Northern Virginia. And the college town vote was way down. Charlottesville, being the largest, Blacksburg, Virginia, these areas, Mark Warner carried them, but he didn't have the same turnout. So Democrats didn't get excited about Mark Warner and didn't show up in the kind of droves they usually do. Republicans were, if they weren't excited about Gillespie, they were excited about sending a message to Obama. And so the end result was a very close race, and Gillespie led all night until he hit the wall in Fairfax County, Arlington, and Alexandria, a much more urbanized area home to a lot of Korean Americans and a lot of ethnics. And although Ed made a lot of outreaches into the ethnic community, when he got to Fairfax, he hit a wall. But when you rank these states, how Romney did in each of these states where there was a Senate election, the states that Romney carried, we picked up every Senate seat. There are 4 seats after that where Romney and Obama were relatively close. The Republicans won 2 of them in Colorado and Iowa. They were close in the other 2, which were New Hampshire and Virginia. So this just followed the pattern of parliamentary voting that we saw in the Senate races across the board, and which we're seeing more and more of in the American electorate, and Earl knows that from North Dakota.
It shows also the sophistication of the Republican Party this cycle. Virginia would, in other times, have come up with a state legislator from down south, southern part of the state, someone very much reflective of the political views there, but not going to do well at all in Northern Virginia. And it would have been a walk for Mark Warner, as it was when he was first elected. This time, no. And so although Ed did hit the blue wall, he did depress the vote, the Warner vote out of here from other times. It proved to be a Washington lobbyist, political operative, was a very wise choice for candidate in the state of Virginia, and one that frankly wouldn't have been possible in light of the convention domination of Republican politics in prior cycles.
Would that have helped Larry Hogan, who had never run for office before?
Well, I think Larry had run for Congress and been crushed.
His dad had been a member of Congress.
Yeah, and
I don't know that he had
I
run.
think he had run out there against Hoyer and had been absolutely crushed. When it started out, nobody gave him a chance. But what happened is the rural vote. You take a look at. I think the Post had a thing on it today. The rural vote just much higher than it was in 2010 when Ehrlich ran, and the urban vote was very depressed. It wasn't even a close race. But you've got O'Malley in there checking every Democratic box. The gay marriage box, the trial lawyers box, the high tax box, trying to please all of these Democratic constituencies because he's going to run for president. And the average Marylander is saying, well, what about me? I'm paying a lot more in taxes now. I don't see any better outcomes. And they got angry. And then Anthony Brown, who was the lieutenant governor, he had one job that he was given, and that was to get their health care thing online. And that just crashed. It crashed and burned. By the way, O'Malley was asked at one point what went wrong, and he said we should have hired Deloitte. I just want to put a plug in for my firm. That we hired IBM, we should have hired Deloitte because we had four exchanges up perfectly. But it crashed and burned, and that was Anthony Brown's answer. He also, although Anthony Brown was an African American, a Harvard graduate, he was a veteran, a great resume, he just didn't seem to connect. And, you look at Hogan up there, he's got a beautiful wife. He kind of looks like a bar bouncer. I mean, he's not this suave, sophisticated guy, as you see, but the everyman could relate to him. And people were paying high taxes and they protested.
I do think Democrats deserve to lose some places where they'd consolidated control and run an agenda that was just a bit off of where, where the main independent thought of the voters were. The lesson Bill Clinton taught the Democrats was if you actually can quit offending the heck out of the middle of the road and get them to vote for you, maybe you're going to win some elections. Well, we've, in place after place, forgot that one. And if you look at Colorado, Mark Udall, who's one of the most pleasant people you'll ever meet, got caught in a bad sandwich. The Obama unpopularity we've been talking about, but also the Colorado legislature, Democratic governor, Democratic House, Senate, had done a lot of things that leading with guns that were unsettling to the Colorado voters. So they were mad at the Democrats at the state level, they were mad at the White House, and Udall got crushed in between. I do think that these places where they'd had consolidated control, Democrats had trouble. Look at Massachusetts. To lose Massachusetts and Maryland, two of the blue states in the country, we got to go back and study the Clinton playbook a little more, I think.
Tom, when you represented Virginia 11th District, you had a lot of Asian Americans in your district. And do you see any trends as to how Asian Americans are voting? At one time, the stats were about 70% Democratic, and I think the Post had a story that showed in this past election, based on voter surveys as the voters left the voting booths, that about 46% of the Asians voted Republican. Does that mean anything to you?
I think it means a lot. Look, Fairfax is going to become a minority county. Meaning when you put African Americans, Asians, Hispanics together, they will be and that's the way the country's going. The population, the white population that settled this country originally, their percentage is going down and down. We're becoming a much more diverse country. That doesn't have to divide us, and it certainly shouldn't divide us politically, because the important issues on the economy and taxes and these issues, they're absolutely color and ethnic blind. But I think the Democrats have done a good job in what I call identity politics, of looking at, we've appointed these people from this race and this and the like on it, and people get attracted to that when they look up at a Republican Party and see nothing but white male faces. In effect, though, doesn't mean their policies are better. Let me give you an example. We have in Fairfax County a high school which I helped start when I was on the county board. Some of you may have heard of it, Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. I helped start that school. Today, that school is almost 60% Asian with the entering class there. But we have the administration suing it because they don't think it's diverse enough. They never sued when it was a white majority. But the Africans Americans, well, you don't have enough African Americans and Hispanic in there. We don't have affirmative action. This is strictly you test into this. The rules are the same for everyone. And the Asian population has been able to gain admittance because they work harder, they study for it, and they work for it. And so the Republican answer to this is, look, everybody gets a fair chance, nobody gets an unfair chance, and have stayed by that. The difficulty as the Democrats start pleasing these different groups is you start siding with one group against another. And in the case of Thomas Jefferson High School, it makes no sense to sue this school for not having enough diversity when it is colorblind and when the Asians on a meritorious basis have been able to get admissions. We had the same thing in the University of California system. At one point there were quotas on who you could take. There were Asians at the time who said, don't lift the quotas. Well, they lifted the quotas, and guess what? You've been to Berkeley or UCLA now? It's top heavy with Asians. In this country, all we can guarantee is equal opportunity. We can't guarantee equal outcomes or equal results. This economic system dies when you start doing that. And we had a thesis at the beginning of the century called the Turner Thesis, which said when America stretched from sea to shining sea, that the pioneer spirit in America would be gone. But they're wrong, because the pioneer spirit emerges with each new immigrant that comes to this country, because they bring with them that pioneer spirit. My dry cleaners, guy worked 6 days a week, hard every day. His kids were in there after school and on Saturdays. One went to Princeton, one went to West Point. One became a doctor. It's hard work. And my kids learned from that. You're the pioneers. And I think the rightful place is with the Republican Party, but if our people aren't talking to you, if they're not out in the community listening to your concerns, if they're not addressing that, we deserve to lose.
Earl, let me ask you the same question a little bit different way. You come from an enormously red state. Year after year, 65, 67%, they would vote Republican except for you. And with the exception of 2010, I mean, I had one of those years in my primary in 2012.
That's different, though.
A little bit different, you bet. But how did you do it?
It gets to, I loved your analogy, Tom, or the metaphor of the jersey. There were several cycles where I won in spite of being a Democrat because I'd established the Pomeroy brand. And they'd vote the Pomeroy Party. Well, in 2010, with another superb job by the campaign committee, they took that away with the 97% votes with Nancy Pelosi and that kind of thing. And they basically took away my independent branding and made me a Democrat, something I tried energetically to avoid for 18 years, successfully for 18, but not that 10th reelect. And so it was just a matter of the starting, they are less discerning about the individual, more, what party label is after you.
Yeah, and let me get into that a little bit. So they used to vote for the person, now they're voting for the party. There are a couple reasons for that. One is these districts are pre-drawn so much. 80% of these districts are pre-drawn that we don't look at safe Democratic districts when we're targeting on the Republican side. We don't look at safe, we look at the narrow focus on those districts, and as that group became narrower, all of a sudden you come in the crosshairs. Secondly, we see a lot of mobility in the American electorate now, people moving across state lines. So in my district, the people that have lived in Fairfax more than 10 years, I was getting 70% of the vote. People that were moving in new, I was getting 45% of the vote. It's harder to brand yourself when you have a transient population. And the ability of the campaign committees to target now and polarize these marginal seats like Earl had and like I had, plus the transiency of the population and so on, have just really led into areas where these are almost parliamentary voting patterns.
With regard to some of the new Senate members, do you see their presence as having any significance in the change of philosophy, momentum, direction of the Senate,
well,
in addition to being in the majority?
Yeah, I mean, the Republicans in control is everything. I mean, the real key for Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, and for John Boehner, the Speaker, is can they deliver their caucus? Can they put together a work product? The problem for McConnell is he's going to have two members out there that are operating as independent agents, Ted Cruz and Rand Paul. They're going to be running for president. They're going to be marching to the beat of their own drum. They're less interested in being team players than they are out there running for the nomination, running against Washington. That makes it hard to manage when you only have probably 54 members. Boehner's got the same problem with a number of members in their conference. These members are not team players. They're out there worried about their primaries or playing to some conservative interest group. And no matter how conservative he may make it, they're going to make sure they're to the right of that and keep their credibility with some of these groups. So I think it's a business cycle. It's a business decision to make sure you're more conservative than anybody else. And it makes it hard for these guys to manage and put forward a product. If they can do that, if the Republicans can unite, they can put some things on the president's desk and force him to either sign it or veto it, and at least start a conversation between the two that's not currently taking place. If they can't put that product together, it will be the death of the Republican Party in 2016, because they're going to say, well, we elected you guys, you can't even get a budget out.
You both saw the.
I think that's very interesting, and I want to give you a view of why I think that this wave bolstering Republican membership, House and Senate, will in a way be moderating relative to the Republican caucuses. They picked up 3 seats in New York, 2 in Illinois, 1 in New Hampshire. Now this is ground that one might have thought Republicans couldn't win anymore. They got some blue areas back into the caucus. Well, you can't go full tilt off where some would take the House caucus and without completely selling these people out. They're absolutely death on reelect. So they're going to have to they're going to have to moderate their politics just a bit, or maybe with this large caucus, Boehner can get to 218 without doing a deal with the other side, and he can still leave some of the yahoos beside. He needs to marginalize that far right flank. He was unable to do it this Congress, but I think he'll have more running room to do it next Congress. On the Senate side, well, the 6-year of the last wave comes home. So 2010, this huge wave, which means that the 24 Republicans, 10 Democrats up next time, and you've got a number of states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, very much Wisconsin. We're 13 months from the last government shutdown is one model of confrontation. How'd that work? It didn't work. I think they're going to want to, and Mitch McConnell certainly is savvy enough to know that, they're going to show that they are adult enough to govern, getting back to his quote. And I think that they're going to find areas, they're going to jam the president all over the place, don't get me wrong, but they'll also find some deals, some areas.
Yeah, it's to their advantage for these swing seats that'll be up in 2 years. The difficulty is, I think, that Cruz and Paul probably don't care.
They don't care.
And that, so it doesn't give you much margin. Mike Lee may not care. So we'll see, but you make a very good point.
We're going to have Rand Paul here next week, so. We have about 10 minutes for questions. And does anybody have any questions? Okay, Florence over here. Somebody want to bring the mic to her?
Florence Lowley, Global America Business Institute. Both of you have touched up on this issue briefly, but traditionally, we have red states and Democrat states and Republican states. And Mr. Pomeroy, you mentioned that Massachusetts, my home state, used to be very Democratic. So is Maryland. And Virginia is known as more very Republican. And now it's sort of becoming mushy-mushy. And I'm not sure if it's a demographic issues or people are getting more intelligent about the topic issues. Or me personally, I used to vote for party line. But now I'm voting more of an issue point. So am I just a minority or is this going?
The state legislature is Democratic. The congressional delegation is all Democratic. You have a Democratic coalition in Massachusetts that we say is town and gown. So you have the college, higher income Democrats, and you have the blue collar lunch bucket Democrats. They don't agree on much, except that they're Democrats. And the the state capital, the legislature there has had some corruption issue. So traditionally, if you look, 4 of the last 5 governors in Massachusetts that were elected have been Republicans. They do that to protect them from a more corrupt Democratic legislature. In Maryland, it was the biggest surprise of all to me, but it's frankly what happened is the more rural areas and ex-urban areas of the state just revolted against these tax hikes. And the urban areas, the African-American vote, which has been the backbone of the Democratic vote, just didn't come out. But Maryland is still a very, very blue state. I think the Republicans only picked up 1 or 2 seats in the legislature underneath this. They just overperformed in their strong areas that went through. So this wasn't through. Now, they almost picked up a congressional seat out in the western part, where in Hagerstown and Frederick and these areas ended up voting Republican. But they're still pretty solid. Virginia is a purple state. I'll give you one fact. You had over 20 states that were decided by less than 5 percentage points. When Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976, when Kennedy was elected in 1960, in the last Obama election, only 4 states were decided by 5 points. Most states are pretty definitively red and blue at the presidential level when everybody shows up. But in off-year elections, usually it's the angry people that show up, and it can skew the turn-up. In 2006, it was the Democrats. In 2010, it was the Republicans.
I would love the premise of your question to be true. Are people leaving party behind and becoming more discerning? I think it's going the opposite way. 40% of counties were landslide counties in 1996, hitting 60% of the vote for Bill Clinton in his run against Bob Dole. This last election, 2012, 50% of the counties of this country were 60% for either Romney or for Obama. You have a couple things. So we've talked about this gerrymandering. Well, I was the only congressman from North Dakota, so our lines weren't gerrymandered. But you've also got a phenomenon called the big sort, where people are moving to live with people that think like they do. I still have a place in North Dakota. I still consider myself a North Dakotan, but I work at the Alston Bird Law Firm, wonderful firm. Have to get that in to count at the Deloitte.
I got Deloitte in.
And live in Old Town when I'm in town. I've never lived with people that think like I do before. I mean, it's kind of fun. It's this big sort business. We're getting our information from Fox or MSNBC. It seems to me that the country's being pulled apart in these ways, and I'm very disturbed by it.
Let me just add to that. So Bill Bishop wrote the book, The Big Sort. He's a demographer out of Austin, Texas. He tells the story about his neighborhood in Austin, Texas. They're sitting around at a community picnic, and his neighbor says, "What a wonderful community we have. Here we have gay people, we have Asians, we have Hispanics, we have blacks, we have whites." And Bishop says, "Yeah, but do we have any Republicans?" The answer is no. Then he moved out 30 miles outside of Austin to a neighborhood where, in his old neighborhood, they used to trap the rats and let them go in the woods a few miles away. He moved to a neighborhood 30 miles away where they'd trap the rats and eat them. So there are real cultural differences that are defining politics and living patterns, residential sorting patterns.
Another question there. Yes, sir.
It's naive to complain about negative advertising because it's so self-evidently works. But if all the public sees for months on end is that anyone who runs for office is a venal and corrupt liar, how do you get any respect for Congress or politicians?
It's a very good point. And you run negative advertising. I was chairman of the campaign committee. We ran a lot of negative advertising. I think we did a couple on you, as I recall. Wow, they're pretty good. Didn't work, but because his reputation was so good. But you do it because it works. And what it does is, for the occasional voters, and in a swing state, these occasional voters don't follow it that closely. It's like you're selling bread or you're selling peanut butter. You put the stuff up there and it gets absorbed. And the other thing is it gets your base ginned up. Democrats do this anti-woman stuff on the Republicans. It gets the women angry and gives them a motive to vote. If you watch the closing days of this campaign, we didn't see it, but on black radio, they were playing the ads about, look what's happened in Ferguson, Missouri, you got to come out. The Republicans want to take your rights away. They wouldn't play this to the population at large, but it was really negative stuff on that. Now, let me just give you an example. Obama performed very well in the African-American community the last 2 elections. He's an African-American president, historic figure. But they interviewed people who had waited in line for 2 hours in New York City, a city where there were 91 precincts. Romney didn't get a single vote. And these folks they'd wait 2 hours, some of them in their pajamas, to come out to vote, not for Obama. When they interviewed him, they hated the Republicans. Pew just did a story, a big 10,000 person survey and on Republicans and Democrats. And the only thing Republicans agree on is they hate Democrats. The only thing Democrats agree on is they hate Republicans. But we do negative advertising because it works and it rallies your base together. It's not very pretty, and for most of us that have educations, it's kind of insulting. But it's not aimed at you.
It does work. So you got the political class basically damaging the whole notion of politics and government with the American voter. And the only thing I'd add to what Tom said is with the unlimited dollars that are now flooding into campaigns, it's worse than ever by a magnitude. And so where does this end? I don't know. I in the end, hope we'll be able to get some kind of hands around campaign finance again.
Well, my big concern is that groups such as the Campaign for Primary Responsibility, which spent $1 million against me, Rockford, Illinois TV market, they owned the television stations. There was 2 and 3 incredible documents each day, some of them just real filth. And then the head of this PAC said, "Oh, I like Don Manzullo. He's much more conservative than his opponent, but he's just been there too long."
Been there too long. So I guess your error was you were experienced.
Right.
Well, but what bothers me is all the huge amount of money that's coming in.
It's awful.
Supreme Court protects an individual to spend untold millions against somebody, and yet there's no corresponding right on an individual who runs for office to be able to protect
You're protected
himself.
under the Sullivan versus New York Times doctrine.
Right.
Here's my when Congress tried to change campaign finance reform, and I voted against it, I thought it was a terrible bill, the theory was to get all this big money away from the political parties who were spending this soft money. Yeah. And this was a corrupting influence, and the idea was good. But like a lot of good ideas, the law of unintended consequences takes place. And I said at the time, okay, we're borrowing this money from going to the parties. Where do you think it's going to go? Do you think this money's just going to disappear? Well, it started to seep back in under what was called 527s, and then the Supreme Court came out with their case on Citizens United, and now it is the most corruptible political process in the world in terms of money for campaigns now, far worse than where we started. Would you agree?
Right. Absolutely. All you need is a sponsor of one.
Yeah.
You get a billionaire with their own super
Never tick
PAC.
off a billionaire. That's the whole.
Let's take one more question. Yes, sir. We're in the middle.
Yeah, hi. Creighton Jones with EIR. Mr. Pomeroy, you cited in your initial comments, your final statement was about the fact that the majority of the population is not very optimistic about the future of the country. They do not see the next generation having it better than the previous, which would be itself unprecedented in American history. The total opposite is the case, at least I've heard anecdotally, from people who have visited South Korea, China, and elsewhere, where the young people are very optimistic about the future. You've got robust spending in infrastructure development, science and technology, all these kinds of areas. So I'm wondering, with the shift that's now occurred in the Congress, in the Senate, do you see a potential for the United States to get back to that kind of perspective of nation building again, of coming together and uniting around big infrastructure development projects, science and technology, the things which unite people around a future as opposed to dividing each other, over crumbs?
We've gotten just as the divide has hardened. It seems to me the debate has become much less imaginative and interesting between the parties. So, infrastructure, gosh, you got to spend some money on infrastructure. And so, the Democrats won't be writing any checks, that's for sure. They won't control the appropriations process. Investments in technology. Double down on the National Institute of Health, which back in the 90s was a Newt Gingrich initiative. I don't expect we're going to have spending initiatives coming out of the Republican majorities. I think you're going to have a lot of activity in the tax area. And generally speaking, that it will be addressing important constituencies of the Republican Party, and I think that, frankly, we need to do something about corporate tax reform. But I don't expect that it's going to be the kind of tax activity on tax that hits a middle-class household and gives them the thought that, by gosh, next month's going to be better. I just don't think so. And so I'm not hopeful about turning this around quickly, although we surely wish we could.
You know who's optimistic in this country? Immigrant families that come here. They see an opportunity here. Many of them don't get back home.
Right.
They're coming here and they're bringing that pioneer spirit. That's what's keeping us going right now, quite frankly. But having said that, I think we're in an era where the 2016 election began yesterday. And I'm just afraid, I hope I'm wrong on this, and I think it is to be determined, but I suspect that you're going to have the Republicans at the end of the day saying, you know what, we can take the presidency in 2016, why do we have to compromise now? And sit up there and probably not play ball. And you can have the president sitting up there saying my way or the high. We have an opportunity to make this work, but I just don't think it's going to happen. And I think if the president acts on immigration unilaterally early, I'm not saying he shouldn't do it at the end of the day, but I think he ought to give these guys a chance to see if they can produce before he issues an executive order. If he does this early, it's going to just poison the well for getting other things done. And we're going to be on a sideshow the rest of the year where people don't trust him and members have an excuse not to come to the table. That's my fear. I hope I'm wrong. But.
I know there'll be a lot of interest on immigration. You're trying to wrap up this program, but I just offer, first of all, I think that the importance of the Asian American voter is a hugely important constituency that both the Democrats have enjoyed the support, and I don't know that they've done enough to earn the support. And so I think that that's going to be something they need to pay attention to going forward. The Democrats will be scared to death that they lost in state after state 40% of the Hispanic vote. Now they got 60%, but they're used to 70-30. And so what's going to happen on the immigration issue? My view is the Democrats will be running to seize the high ground relative to the ethnic minority communities that care about that issue so strongly. I fully expect the president to put a marker out unilaterally, and basically in the backlash that ensues from the Republican majority, we're going to hope we recapture some of that constituency we didn't see on Tuesday. Yeah. It's just crass politics.
It is,
but that's what I think is going to happen.
Earl, I think you're probably right. But it is crass politics to say, well, I'm going to wait till after the election to do this because I don't want to hurt. I mean, right. It's just so cynical. But that's the system. And I wish it was just one party, but I think they both play the game.
Well, let's thank Congressman Davis and Congressman Pomeroy for sharing their insights. Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much. People are all good to see you. How's life?